I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Well, good to be here with you, Richard.
Good to be here with you too, Glenn.
Yeah. So glad that we're starting this project together and taking our time tonight to create this inaugural episode of our podcast.
It's a good excuse to hang out more for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we start by just talking a bit about who we are and what's kind of brought us here tonight. I can go first a little bit.
Sure.
So I'm Glenn Wood, a registered clinical counselor. I did my master's at the University of Northern British Columbia, and I graduated just a year ago. I currently work at BC Cancer in Victoria as one of the clinical counselors there in psychosocial oncology. And I'd say that I'm person-centered, existential, psychodynamic therapist, trying to integrate those three modalities, a very process-oriented therapist. Richard, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we can talk a little bit more about what we're trying to accomplish tonight and moving forward with our episodes.
I'm Richard Tadamir, and I am a clinical professor at Simon Fraser University in Surrey, BC. I also do private practice, run a group practice called Relationship Experts Vancouver, which is moving towards becoming more of a collective kind of cooperative situation. And we'll get more into that on our maybe anti-capitalist bent. I come from a similar, I think, to you, Glenn, an existential perspective, meaning-centered, I think, is across everything that I do. Very interested and quite a bit of experience in interpersonal neurobiology. I've been a Canadian certified counselor through Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association for 10 years. I've been a supervisor for about 5 years. So it's been one, I don't know if we can swear, one hell of a ride.
Yeah.
Is that swearing?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the interesting and unique features of this project is that you and I come from different lenses, or I shouldn't say different lenses, but we have different levels of experience, and that informs our perspective. I'm just a little baby counselor. I'm brand new to the space. I'm still trying to make sense of things, but you come with more experience. You've accomplished quite a bit in your career, Richard, and you have.
Thank you.
Yeah, more under your belt for sure.
You're an old soul, though, Glenn.
Well, yeah, for sure. But I think that's part of what we're bringing here is a dialogue between two different perspectives in terms of experience, in terms of, just time in the field. You know, I come from a place of novicehood and you a little bit more expertise.
I think it's going to be enlightening. Hey, what was your interest in starting this podcast, Glenn?
If I'm honest, Richard, it comes from a place of I just feel like I have so much to say.
Two white guys with lots to say.
Yeah, for sure, right?
Here's another one.
Nothing new about that. Well, my wife will tell you this. I don't shut up about psychotherapy and counseling and theory.
Oh,
right?
My wife too.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with it. You know, ever since I started my master's, really, and kind of entered the space and started to explore it, I've just been absolutely compelled by our discipline and what we do and how we do it and what the implications of it are. And so I've had thoughts and thoughts and thoughts and thoughts and thoughts. And, talking to you, a good friend of mine, right? It just really made sense. It seemed to extend the conversation beyond us to bring people into, our thoughts and perspectives and experiences on the space. And I've got some personal motivations, partly it's I feel like there are real issues in our discipline, real problems, real challenges that we face that I don't know are being expressed to the degree that they could be, or I don't know that are, being identified or adequately approached. And so to me, it feels important to kind of extend that concern in a broader way. And also it's about me. It's also about the challenges I encounter as a therapist and about working on my own and working to my own integration. That talking with you about these things is also a way of me talking through my own challenges as a therapist and coming to consensus within myself about, how I really feel and how I'd want to move forward and address some of these things. So a lot's brought me here. Mostly just I have so much to say. How about you, Richard? What's brought you to this space?
Similar. Many beginning formulations of thoughts, and then other concepts, having worked in government, health authority, private practice, community services, a little bit in the US, a little bit in the UK, but mostly in Canada, having a lot of conversations have lots of family and some colleagues in Ontario, even interprovincially too. It's made me really think about how similar to you, of there's some big issues. The more that I travel or talk with people, other therapists, and the public as well, clients, they can tell us, especially our clients, if we actually dare to listen, what we need to improve on as therapists and the field. So it's a drive to become a better therapist, not a perfect therapist, but a drive to excellence. Scott Miller, feedback informed therapy kind of idea, and seeing where therapy is good and adds so many benefits, and where we have yet to go. So I think we're going to take a critical eye on ourselves and on our profession, and that's going to make it hella interesting.
For sure. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the main space I'm coming from, is that there's a great deal that's established in our industry that I find problematic. I want to spend time deconstructing with you. There's a kind of dehumanizing element, which we'll speak more about further in the episode. But I feel like that's part of what motivates this as well, right? Is I actually, out of a sense of compassion for the people that we work with and for myself as well, right? That the kind of therapy that's often enacted in our contemporary era, despite looking helpful on paper, isn't truly helpful within our clients.
And our clients are telling us this, in pretty high number, or they tell us by their absence.
Yeah, for sure. But
it's about being a better human and getting closer to the good life and a more meaningful life, I think, for ourselves as this therapist, the field, and ultimately for clients, because we're clients too.
That's right.
Both
that's right.
go to therapy, and
That's right. Yeah, I think that's good to bring to our listeners, that we're not just practitioners of psychotherapy, but also consumers of it, and that informs our perspective as well.
And I feel sorry for the therapist that has to work with.
No kidding.
They get an earful for sure.
Oh yeah. So tonight, Richard, I think that you and I had talked about wanting to just really start by looking at the kind of the period in history that we're in, kind of evaluating the contemporary space of psychotherapy. We've talked about this idea of being at a place where there's a great number of innovations on the horizon. And these are worth exploring and discussing. These pose tremendous possibilities and also huge problems for the therapy space. And so that's kind of where we wanted to go tonight, I think, right? Was discussing kind of what's coming down the pipe. So in your mind, what are some of these things which are pervading our space, which are showing up?
Yeah, we made a little bit of a list, and this is obviously not all inclusive, and listeners are welcome to add to this list, and I'm sure we will over time. And we don't want this to be a podcast just about our version of the future, two white guys. But we're going to locate it in broader concepts, anti-oppressive, anti-colonial, and multiple therapeutic modalities, and even spiritual perspectives. So hopefully we can have a lot of diverse voice in here, and maybe hopefully future guests, we're gonna wrangle them to hear that. So some diverse voices. Some of the things that we see that are here, obviously present already for a while: managed care, and all the different conceptualizations of that. The US kind of leads in that, and I think it, for better or for worse, especially I think in the privatization, a few corporations essentially controlling the direction and accessibility to services and what they deem is a service or not, and what they will reimburse clients for or not. I mentioned that briefly already. Feedback informed treatment, kind of outcome driven care. There is now value-based care is the latest term. And I think it's important to think about, well, who decides what is of value? Are there components around? So is it just an economic formulation, or is it, again, maybe a more human formulation, right? And about, certainly I know in value-based care, the emphasis on client progress, but that can be looked at in a lot of different ways. Increasingly technical therapies, whether that's EMDR or whether that's a use of technology. I use EMDR. I use it sometimes on the computer with clients where they're Zooming and they have a dot zooming across the screen. I know other therapists that still use their fingers even when they're across Zoom, and it seems to be pretty effective. But we can talk a little bit about the pros and cons, I think, of this, right? We are more connected, but more isolated also than we ever have been in human history. That connects into AI-driven technology, therapization of society, kind of influencer therapists, or maybe we dig deeper, they're not even therapists, they're just influencers that tag on kind of a guru nature to themselves and the problems about that, while also being aware, how can we mindfully use social media? These tools, all of these tools we're mentioning, they're important and we ignore them to our peril. So we want to think about that. I am trained in psychedelic assisted therapy. I'm very interested in research around it, the practice of it, group work, individual work, transpersonal therapy. I do see it as one way, not the only way, but one step towards helping maybe people access their humanity and their values that maybe they've disconnected from. And we can't, not talk about the influence of capitalism as well in this, right? Capitalism being kind of the only economic structure that kind of, the way that it keeps existing is by saying that there's no alternative, and to even kind of think of an alternative is considered
heresy.
Heresy.
So
those are some of the broad strokes.
Well, what I'm really curious about, just to start with you around this, Richard, and maybe you could start and then I can share my experience too, is when you think about these things, we've come up with quite a list there, there may be more, but just like, what are you encountering?
Yeah.
What's real for you right now in your space and where you are in your career? Like
I love that. I love
where,
that.
Where are these intersecting? Right. Yeah.
I love that. Like in the therapy room and with counselor trainees and the questions that they ask and the questions I reflect on myself. I think that's so important. Everything is, we want to make it personal. I see so many things. I think because a lot of my time is spent with counselor trainees, they're trying to think of all, the practicums being as they are right now. We're in the middle of inflation. It's very difficult. I see students, for example, having to move multiple times in a semester. So to make it real, there's some real world issues affecting therapists as well, and affecting their mental health, which makes it harder to practice. And I think in many ways, the system that we've created, and maybe again, that's what spurred us talking more about this. And we're going through this, right, in healthcare, and Parliament is going through this in healthcare in general. But I don't think enough has been paid attention to around mental health specifically. The mental health care system, certainly, and social service system is in crisis, and it has way more clients than it does services. It is can be very isolating for practitioners and for entire service programs. And even as a professional, so I still keep finding out each day about programs that maybe have already been existed for 10 years, but I've never heard about. And certainly my clients may have not heard about them. And so I see issues of kind of twofold in one sense that really get me going and are coming to my attention every day. Is the counselor trainee is really wanting to be good therapists and wanting to get to know themselves and get to know the clients as humans. They are, worse than mac and cheese, right? They're continually going into debt to become therapists, to do kind of this noble calling. And our profession has way too much martyrdom, and it needs to change. It's not sustainable. We see healthcare workers in all categories, and I was analyzing StatsCan data for a PhD class that I was in. Burnout like never before after, as the pandemic, at the peak of the pandemic in the last year and a half, and then as we're ending it, that we are dealing with these issues. The pandemic just brought so many issues around inaccessibility to mental health care, inaccessibility to good quality therapy training programs. That's something that really gets me all the time is how can we make things more accessible? And these are the problems that clients and therapists come to me every day, and they're struggling. We shouldn't be waiting 6 months, a year to be able to get a therapist. In some cases, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Sure. Yeah, like I'm kind of hearing there, like just starting with the idea of cost. And I can certainly relate to that and have thoughts on that on a couple of levels. Like first, as someone who's not that far away from his practicum, I can say as well that it was a time when I was financially stretched. And it's like a hidden cost in the program. It's not just your tuition fees, but you're paying in lost wages, in the time that you devote. And it's kind of absurd in a way when you think about other professions that are with similar credentials or synonymous credentials, I guess. And me and my fellow students would kind of muse about this. Like, let's say you call a plumber to your house and you get like a Red Seal certified plumber. That plumber is going to have something like 2,000 or 5,000 supervised hours of practice under his or her belt before they are Red Sealed certified. And so that person, when they come and they evaluate your toilet, kind of knows what they're up to. And those hours were paid a lower rate, admittedly, but like they were paid
still
hours
paid,
so that people could have the extensive apprenticeship support to be able to reach a level of professional confidence and capacity that they could work independent. We get 150 hours, I think, right now of unpaid supervised experience. And I think that based like the program that I went to, for sure, it was like, there were like the practicum site I went to was really good. We got lots of direct supervision, but there were plenty of sites that people went to where there was like no direct supervision and a lot of like, in some cases, insufficient supervision. And I feel like that's not uncommon across programs across the province and the country. How can we expect like excellent professional capacity from new counselors when they're getting the equivalent to like an introductory course in counseling and then told to go and make their way? So certainly a problem in the space in terms of adequate education and just financial support around the learning process. Yeah.
What about you? What other issues do you in your talk? I know you also have a book club that you meet with some colleagues about. What are you guys talking about as some of the issues? What seems to be the hot topics?
I guess I've got several thoughts, just going back to the notion of kind of innovations in the space and the list that we talked about. And I'll thread the book club in there because it's been a really excellent place to kind of bring my concerns and be heard and validated and also have the kind of experiences that I feel are meaningful. I guess I'll say the first thing is like, it's really interesting being a new counselor in this era, because our era is defined by multiplicity, like a multiplicity of disciplines, diversity in the space. And it's like, no one's really telling you how to make sense of that. I was pretty appalled actually in my master's that the theory course that I got was like equivalent to a psychology undergrad theory course. Like it was basically no more advanced. It was basically just like, here's this theory, here's this theory, here's this theory. And then like a little bit on like, okay, and you should integrate them. And it was like, no one really talked about the problems around integration. No one really talked about the incommensurate nature of different theoretical orientations, they don't fit well together. And we heard a lot of implicit messages from different faculty about how one ought to practice, sometimes contradictory messages that I think ultimately for me, it was just really confusing. And I think I kept referencing, okay, well, I'm hearing, in my textbook and in popular media and, kind of from some of my professors that like counseling and psychotherapy is maybe one way, but like I have an interest in some of these other orientations and also like a personal investment in them. Even like I have this felt sense of like their helpfulness, but like that's not really being validated for me. So I really feel like that's been a big part of my experience as a novice counselor, is just trying to make sense of my own intimations about how to counsel in light of even just going broader than, we can talk about managed care because that's part of it too, but even just the idea of like being empirically informed, because that's like a big one. Like that's a really big kind of standard in our industry, which I think, has some problems, can be critiqued, I should say. So that's one place that I've encountered some of this, is like just in making sense of how to even practice. There's a strong pressure from a number of different kind of institutional sources about the way that we're supposed to practice. But then there's my own personal sense of that. And it's been conflicting.
And not naming any names, of course, but what kind of messages did you get in your education as a whole that might be contradictory?
I think I was wounded in my undergrad, like as a psychology undergrad. I was strong-armed. I won't go into detail because I don't necessarily want to go to that, but I was like really strong-armed by some influential people in my undergrad. It was empirical or bust, basically. And it was basically like, if there wasn't some research evaluating this approach and demonstrating its effectiveness according to these parameters, then you shouldn't do it. It wasn't effective. And this was echoed not that long ago. I did some DBT training begrudgingly, but to kind of flesh out my resume a little bit. And it was there too. The instructor was like, you really have to be doing empirically evaluated therapies, or you shouldn't be doing therapy at all. It's been hard to hear. And it's not to say that the therapies that I'm interested in aren't empirically validated. I feel very strongly about the person-centered orientation. Carl Rogers was an innovator in that space, actually, in terms of psychotherapy research. I feel very strongly about psychodynamic psychotherapy. There's actually lots of robust research showing the effectiveness of psychotherapy. It's just that the language is different, and the mode of evaluation is different,
and they're not all manualized.
But that's a nuanced thing to understand, and a lot of young therapists, I think they won't. If your teachers, if your instructors and professors aren't honoring that or aren't acknowledging that, then I think a lot of people just end up carrying this, or they end up conflicted, or they end up just going along with it. I think they miss out on some very critical perspectives in psychotherapy, which are essential to integrate into one's practice. Because I think that that's part of it, is there's implicit messages in the way that we're instructed in psychotherapy that support notions like managed care. Like these are extended from the industry into our classrooms. So when we talk about some of the contemporary problems, it's like, that's because the industry's influence is reaching into the way that we're educated. From moment one, it's like, yeah, you've got to have a plan. You've got to set goals with your client. You've got to make sure that you're evaluating outcomes. And you have to be strategic in how you get there. You have to make sure that you're giving them the tools they need, and this is so contradictory to my intimations. Therapy can be just about experiencing oneself. Therapy can just be about really understanding the complex and deep dynamics of one's own inner experience and repositioning oneself from that understanding. But this was like, I wasn't going to get it.
So in short, forgive me for this over summary, but we run into problems when we try to make therapy to appeal to the gods of medicine, to make it too much like medicine, when it's both an art and a science. Yeah.
100%. And I think when we look at our list again, it's like one thing that we maybe forgot to reference there, but which is so important, is the dominant medical perspective in our industry and its pervasion. And some of these so-called innovations, I think, lead directly from that. They stem directly from that.
And it's interesting too, because if we want to talk about research, because I can throw down around research.
Sure. Yeah, like, you can.
The dodo bird effect. I'm sure you came across this. That 100%. Really, the difference between modalities, even your so-called empirical evidence-based modalities, CBT, etc. The difference in effectiveness between these modalities is little in terms of effectiveness. Something, you'd have to look up the stats, but something from what I remember, around 8% right? It's a
Negligible.
small, it's pretty negligible. And what really matters is the relationship, anything we're doing towards developing the real relationship. And there's some different pathways around that. I think Scott Miller does some excellent work in feedback informed therapy around understand everything is about the relationship, and people are leaving towards shamans or fortune teller or whatever, and maybe some of those people are very, very insightful, but in any case they're not finding therapy as healing, let's say, to use a non-scientific term, for themselves, because the therapist doesn't get it. The therapist doesn't get them, or is hiding behind a veil of theory, hiding behind a veil of manuals. It's to be blunt, I go through this constant internal battle myself. It's an excuse, right, for lack of vulnerability.
That's such a good point, Richard. And that was certainly an experience I had in my practicum, and I'm glad it was supported, because I don't know that it always is. That it's like, oh yeah, if you want to do something with your clients, you have to be prepared to experience it yourself. This idea that you can only take people as far as you've gone, supervision really being experiential, not just information, but no, you have the experience that you would want to provide someone else in the room. And that means being vulnerable, and that means creating space for my own vulnerability. And I found, at least, the more I can do that, the more I can help other people to do that. And when I can't do that, then I can't help other people do that. And that's a layer of work that I think in the research community isn't acknowledged, like the personal development of a therapist. Speaking of Scott Miller, I'm fairly certain I watched a talk of his not that long ago. It was from 2013, but just consistent with this idea of like the dodo bird effect. One of the things that he saw in the research was actually that while therapies can't predict like very good outcome, like you can't predict, or you're not going to get a better outcome from a particular therapy. You certainly will get a better outcome from a particular therapist.
Oh, hells yeah.
Yeah. And there was research in the United States at this one children's mental hospital. They followed these patients for like 20 years or something. And it was like every single patient that was kind of doing really, really well 20 years later, they all had the same therapist.
Oh my gosh.
That speaks to individual factors that make up good therapy,
Yes.
right? Like it speaks to something outside of technique or manualization. It speaks to something unique and specific to an individual. And I don't think it's something that can't be trained or fostered or developed, but it's probably not something that can be prescribed. And it's probably not something that can be spelled out outside of the personal work that we need to go through as therapists as part of our development.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can add a link or a reference later.
Sure.
I remember reading of this idea of the pathways of the change process and these conditions that are necessary for change in clients.
Yeah.
One of those big components is that certainly we've developed a real relationship where they trust us and they have confidence in us. The other part is that we have to be able to explain what we do in a way that not only makes sense to us, but really ultimately makes sense to the client. So, and this is where cultural sensitivity can even come into play. If they're a Peruvian immigrant, let's say, maybe the conceptions of understanding the world around what is normal, our connection with our ancestors, etc., the supernatural, it's a different worldview. Right? Of course, globally, the world is becoming very westernized and globalization. But what that means is to really help go down from our ivory towers and join the suffering masses here and find a way of helping therapy make sense to clients. And there's some other conditions too, but these conditions really stand out to me. I guess the other thing is that process. Do we have a process of what change looks like for this client? And it is a question that we certainly do ask graduate students as they're entering a program and they graduate. I think locating ourselves in what are these fundamental conditions? Rogers laid out his 3 conditions, of course, but now in research, we're looking at even more specifically what makes a good therapist. Scott Miller talks about super shrinks. What makes these super shrinks? And I think we have to your point earlier, focus much more on the integration of what makes a good human and next of all, maybe a good therapist, to get the effects that we want. It's not just copying what is the newest, and not to completely dismiss those are important, but they're not going to have the effect that we want, or people aren't even going to utilize them. Let's say, I was reading an article about transcranial magnetic stimulation, really interesting, effects around treatment resistant depression. But if we don't explain this in a way that makes sense to the client, if it's not accessible to a client, and also maybe there's other types of therapy, or just again, being two humans relating to each other, that haven't been tried and could be very effective for this client.
I'm thinking now about something Kim Barthel, occupational therapist.
Shout out to her.
Shout out to Kim. Yeah. She said, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So just riffing off that idea of, if a therapist shows up differently, sometimes that can make all the difference. Even if their aim is the same, they show up differently, that can make the difference. So kind of going back to our list, that I want to connect with what you just said, because it made a lot of sense to me. I heard something of some of the concerns that we have around some of these innovations, that there's almost like there's a culture that surrounds the way that we respond to human suffering that is missing some of these components which we're trying to address. And that's where some of these innovations are fitting in, that we pathologize suffering. So we see suffering as something abnormal, and then we try to fix suffering. And this culture is all too quick to offer solutions. So I see AI is a good example, or an extension of that. Is how do we make these solutions or these fixes more accessible and less expensive? I see, managed care and outcome-driven care as examples of that. Like, how do we refine our processes to better enact these solutions? We'll talk more about psychedelics, because I know it's quite nuanced, but one way of looking at psychedelics is to look at it as a quick fix, a single treatment that produces the desired outcome. And there's less emphasis on suffering as an innate component of human life, and suffering as something that actually has value and brings value to our lives. So my contribution here is just this idea of there's a culture that kind of underlies all of this. And it's hard not to say that a large part of the influence around that is capitalization.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Consumerism. This quick fix. And of course, we enter this field to help reduce human suffering. And I'm sure we'll talk maybe a little bit about Buddhist principles, other principles I think that we've been influenced by. Yeah, as you said, it's kind of this over medicalization of what could be, normal human experience, the normal human experience. And people are in already enough pain, is the way that I see it. Do we need to add judgment? Do we need to add that there is something defective with them, that they are outside of normal? Do we have to add all of this pathology? And one thing I like about counseling psychology versus some other streams of psychology is because we came out of a very practical world, right? Coming out of community, coming out of connections to social work, coming out of veterans, suffering from World War II, these different aspects of what does counseling look like, not in the sacred halls of academia, but what does it look like to the people consuming it?
Yeah, it's very different on the ground than it is in universities. I think that's one of the critiques too of a lot of psychotherapy research is it's inorganic. Sure, for evaluation purposes, it can be useful to some degree, but no one practices the way that researchers get practitioners to practice, right? Like some form of integration is the norm. Then why are we studying purist therapies as though that's what people are actually doing, or what people are encountering? I had a big thought that I wanted to bring to the conversation now. Oh yeah, it was this. I think one of the things that I'm most concerned about is the pathologizing of suffering, because I think that does something problematic. If we look at suffering as a normal component of human experience, if we look at suffering as an inevitability, as just an innate component of living, and if suffering as having value, then I think that pathologizing suffering intensifies it, because I think that it supports its repression. So one of the things I'm thinking about when it comes to the future of therapy is, I think if we don't start depathologizing suffering, not just us counselors, but on a broader social and cultural scale, that it's only likely to increase. And I think we've seen this. Like, I think It's interesting to me, like just going back to Scott Miller again, the research that he showed that psychotherapy really hasn't gotten more effective than it was in the 80s. Some of the innovations that have been brought to bear have been useless. I think there was research that came out of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, the director of the National Health Organization there said, we're going to put all this money into the brain, into neurobiology, into neurobiology innovations, because we really think that's the way to go. Obviously, the brain is the locus of our experience. If we can really understand neurobiology, we can really understand suffering and address it. And after a, multi-year campaign and millions of dollars spent, they sort of went, you know what? This has kind of gotten us nowhere. Outcomes are the same. People aren't really getting better. I think that as long as suffering is something that needs to be taken off the table, that can't be embraced, it will remain. I think what I'm speaking about is the idea that there's value in it, there's hidden value in it. And certainly I've encountered this as a therapist. Again, it feels like a radical notion in this contemporary era, but this idea of taking people into their suffering as opposed to out of it. I said a lot of things there, Richard, so forgive me.
Oh, no, it's great. I love that phrase, to take people into their suffering, because there's so much value in there if we can develop a relationship, I guess, with it.
Yeah.
It might not always be our best buddy.
For me, it started with reading Rollo May. And Rollo May had this idea from Dante's Inferno, which was, I think, it really impacted him, reading Dante. And I don't know if you know much about the Inferno, but the basic metaphor.
I know what the basics, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the basic metaphor of it is like Dante ends up in hell, like he's just in hell. And it's this awful place. And there's like only one way to get out of it, which is to kind of go forward. And he's scared and he's overwhelmed and he doesn't know what to do. And then the poet Virgil just kind of shows up and is like, okay, well, yeah, like this sucks, but I'll kind of walk with you. And Virgil doesn't try to fix it. He doesn't try to change anything. He's just kind of there with Dante throughout the whole process and keeps him moving forward. And Dante goes into it. He goes through hell. And Rollo May's like, that's it for us, right? Like that's our role. We're Virgils. We
love that.
We don't try to fix, we don't try to change. Because again, it's like the experience of hell is what brings its meaning. That basic metaphor, like this can actually be important, this can actually be valuable, this could actually be meaningful. Our suffering could actually be carrying something important that we're ignoring, some important component of our experience that we're not accessing. So that influenced me, like that hit me. And again, going back to this, okay, I'm a new counselor, I'm in this space. Where am I finding that? Where am I finding consonant voices that also express that? A lot of stuff around me was how to get out of suffering, teach people breathing techniques. Here's a thought stopping technique. Here's something meant to help make this go away. But like, I have this real sense, maybe we should go there. Maybe that's the place to go. And so it's been confusing.
Well, I think even the most experienced therapist, how much do we come to terms with our own suffering, our own weakness, our own vulnerability? I'm encountering this in psychedelic therapy, how I think it should be practiced. And I think where I'm coming from is from a very complex and spiritually informed and kind of multifaceted lens that, you could do psychedelic therapy and be one of the new research companies that has produced psilocybin into a synthetic form, and it's $1,000 a pop. Or we can do it in a way that's been practiced for thousands of years, which is connected into nature. It's connected into ritual. It is connected into connection. It has to be relational. And that is actually the real medicine.
And done and guided by someone that knows the way. I'm assuming that's part of it, right?
Guided by someone who knows the way, and who has been through it themselves, right? Experienced suffering, experienced getting in touch with suffering. I think both with and without chosen psychedelic, knows that there is hope on the other side, can be a burden bearer for each other. This is where I see, talking about where therapists struggle. And again, experienced therapists struggle with this. And also, of course, counselor trainees or new therapists struggle with it. And I think is amazing, the work you're doing with BC Cancer, because the question of death is constant, and mortality. And a lot of people and a lot of therapists avoid this question of illness, of death, of weakness,
Mm-hmm.
of these things, because
Mm-hmm.
we're told, and they're not bad people. We're told as therapists that, yeah, our job is to reduce symptomology on the
Yeah.
Beck depression inventory.
Yeah.
And if we don't, then we're not effective. But
Mm-hmm.
what about actually understanding? And I had some really wise and quite spiritually, existentially informed faculty in my master's degree talking about the idea of depression is really just a signal of a deeper issue, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
we've been banging our head against the wall
Mm-hmm.
multiple times trying
Mm-hmm.
to solve a problem, if we perceive it as whatever it is, trying to do the
Mm-hmm.
same thing over and over. And maybe we're reaching out to people and we're getting rejected. Maybe we're trying different therapies and it's not effective. And that anxiety, being kind of the cousin of depression, turns into depression after a while. And
Mm-hmm.
depression is maybe this protective way of our nervous system
Mm-hmm.
expending more energy. And so we actually want to understand it and have a relationship with it and
Mm-hmm.
have somebody with us as we explore that. And it may take some time versus, I get it, stand it. I work in medical clinics as well. And there's maybe a time and a place for that, certainly a time and place for medication. But in other cases, we can be too quick to jump to that. Or we, even if, let's say, an SSRI is needed, are we locating this person in the bigger things going on in their life? Even very simply, First Nations, medicine wheel, for example, of social, spiritual, emotional, mental health. And if we are forgetting that, I've seen many experiences of the client not even taking the medication. And if they do take it, there might be an increase maybe in motivation for a period of time, but they're feeling okay, right? And if people on the screen or listening to podcasts can't see it, but like my hand is making this line across the screen of like this baseline, but they don't really feel they're living a meaningful life. And they still may be contemplating suicide, maybe even if it's just pushed down a little bit further down the road. So medication, these AI, these things are powerful tools and they're important. And I think we want to learn a lot about them. But where context is king, and are we humanizing the person first of all, right?
It kind of comes back to what's it serving. If it's just in the interest of perpetuating this culture of the repression of suffering, it's probably not going to help.
And
right?
This pain is scary. I don't want to feel it as a therapist or clinician or a doctor. So here is this therapy. Here is this medication. Here is this breathing technique.
You just made so many good points about how we're not looking at the right dimensions of people for the roots of the problem and their solution. If we just reduce things down to basic neurobiology, that doesn't quite get us there, because people aren't just neurobiology. People are an experiencing being. I feel like we have to go inside of a person to understand the nature of the problem and its solution. And that seems like something that in our contemporary era, people are increasingly unwilling to do. I can't speak for everyone. I think there are lots of people like you and I, Richard, and there are lots of advancements in there. I mean, we haven't even really mentioned the positive advancements in psychotherapy that are maybe on the fringe, maybe aren't. I don't know. I'm just coming back to concerns. One of the concerns I have is that increasingly our industry will be seen as kind of this dispensement of information or techniques, as opposed to the facilitation of process and experience, and that our roles will change, that we're increasingly being asked to be more like technicians.
And never more so of the example of therapists being located in Walmart in the US.
Oh, really?
And this issue of value-based care. I could say thing that will make everybody cringe. People are needing, they're needing to talk to somebody. We are the loneliest society ever. We're more and more living in urban centers, away from our families and away from places of connection, having to work longer hours. Technology has not lived up to its ideal of giving us more leisure time or more time to connection or more time to work on what really matters. And I think what you said really hits the nail on the head of we are in danger, and the whole field of it is in danger. And clients then are in danger of becoming a problem that a technician can solve or something, apply something to.
It cheapens us. It reduces us to something that we're not. This has been my own countertransference, which I've had to kind of work through. It's been frustrating for me and difficult as a therapist to encounter patients that are just looking for tools or techniques, because I don't understand myself as someone who would provide that. I don't understand my role as just providing information or providing a solution to the patient's problem outside of their own experience and their own process of determination. I've struggled, I think, to make sense. And it's because it's even there. It's not just outside and in these institutions and things like that. It's within the people that we serve as well. Like they're also carrying this idea that their suffering is something that they just need to get a little bit more information around to be able to get their hands on and figure out. If they could just breathe better or think better or
and what a high amount of pressure.
It's like anything but suffering, anything but experiencing the pain.
And it's very hard, right? I'm thinking about my counselor trainees now as we're talking of what do we do when we're faced with someone who's, let's say, a woman in her 50s, chronic pain, multiple incidents of sexual abuse, experience things even at a young age, nobody should ever experience. And it's manifested into her body, both in her nervous system and in her soul. Of course, we want to offer some salve, but maybe that salve is shedding a tear with them. Of course, not being in a position where we're now becoming our therapist, but shedding a tear with them, really realizing the impact of lost years and grieving, going in, as you said, going into the pain. And they're thinking one way. They're thinking, well, my doctor sent me here, or my husband or whoever sent me here because I'm acting out in some way, or I'm complaining or whatever. And I just need to learn how to be a better, happier person. And it's so tempting to give the client what they want, but not maybe what they really need.
Yeah, it is. I'm glad you used that word tempting. Wouldn't we like that as well? Something that takes the pain away. And just going back to this idea of, I think one of the things that makes a good therapist is the capacity to courageously live in the face of suffering.
100%. I was thinking a lot about this as I was getting trained in psychedelic assisted therapy. And I think, again, from a really holistic way, shout out to Therapsil and Dr. Bruce Tobin and all the work for advocacy around end of life distress and really facing clients in their suffering and letting them hear their stories, approaching it from multiple angles. That what I want to help therapists that I work with develop is to tolerate it, right? So looking at that ability there, and then how do we develop that, right? And I think that's part of, what makes a super shrink, because we stay regulated, but regulation doesn't mean that we are detached, right? It means that we are attuned to their nervous system. We're attuned. We have an attached relationship. We're attuned to the full essence of that other person. We're having an encounter with this other human being.
If therapy is an experience, then that's something that's kind of abstract, and it's difficult to quantify, and it's difficult to commodify. And so that's where it goes up against the kind of dominant economic and cultural system that we're in. We can't really sell people back to themselves. We can sell information. We can sell tips and tricks and tools.
Isn't there a lot of information out there?
Yeah, there is. But for anyone to really go into themselves and to be supported to go into themselves, that's a unique, individualized process that has a similar shape but looks pretty different every time. We use this term courage, but courage can mean so many things. What does it mean to really be who we are and to really live in that kind of unbridled way? That's a question that everyone has to answer themselves. And that process is not marketable. So my argument when we talk about kind of moving forward is it's radical. We need to deconstruct this space. We need to get away from the commodification of solutions to human suffering. We need to respect our basic nature, our basic fundamental nature. And therapy needs to occupy that, or it needs to occur there.
You're right. And if it doesn't, then what is it? Again, it might be a technician. We hold an immense amount of responsibility. Clients come to us, again, in their suffering, looking, maybe they don't know it or not, but needing an encounter, let's say. We become another McDonald's or a Walmart or some cheap teleinfo kind of salesperson. And Scott Miller talks about it in how psychotherapy lost its magic. about people, in a sense, have been, or the hope is that we're occupying, and I think it's a tall order, and I think we have to be careful about that, but occupying a place, therapy is occupying a place where religion used to be, right? Where a priest used to be. So I think definitely we need to be able to explore, we're not a priest. And I think, we have to be so careful about giving answers, right? And maybe that's just another way, right? Of like giving these quick fixes, but instead being, and I think the best spiritual leaders are also in that category, of being a co-journeyer, asking the tough questions together and tolerating the discomfort that arises, and maybe even leaning into it, a fellow journeyer.
Yeah, that's right. This has been shared before. I don't think what you and I are saying is new.
No.
I think what I find interesting, though, is how it never seems to penetrate the mainstream.
Capitalism has some pretty thick walls.
And I do want to give some credit to a lot of the contemporary psychotherapy space that's really good and makes sense, like emotion-focused therapy, intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy, depth-oriented brief therapy. There's a lot of innovators in the process-oriented space that have made this, what we're talking about, more accessible and made more sense, and who are out there as voices like we are, kind of advocating for psychotherapy to happen within the person. It just seems like it's not penetrating, though. There's something missing. How is it that this hasn't pervaded the culture more when there's such strong and articulate and potent voice? Like, it's interesting, like, who doesn't love Sue Johnson, and who doesn't, when they watch Sue Johnson, kind of see something powerful? Who doesn't love Carl Rogers? I don't know a single counselor that doesn't love Carl Rogers. And yet somehow we miss that. Somehow we're taken away from that. And I'm not poo-pooing on my fellow counselors, but there does seem to be something that takes us away from this basic and essential messaging, which when we hear it, we just go, oh yeah, that's it.
That's right.
That's it.
Feel it. We have a felt sense of it.
That's right.
I'm sure this would be for a future episode, but why is psychotherapy so dangerous to capitalism, so dangerous to current constructions of neoliberalism, of Keynesian, of any, economics and kind of man-made, certainly very hierarchical, patriarchal structures. Because psychotherapy in its truest form, which really is just two people relating in a very mindful.
What a good question. And my sense is it's because it's a decommodifying process, that in some ways we've commodified ourselves. We've commodified our own experience. And psychotherapy, in the problematic sense that we're talking about, is capitalizing on that. There's perspectives of psychotherapy as a radical emancipation of self. There's perspectives of psychotherapy as a decolonizing practice, which is consistent with this. And maybe that's just it, right? Is that when we do good therapy, it liberates us. And that disempowers the system. That goes against what the kind
maybe
of
it's oppression. It restructures. It risks restructuring the people on top and the way that it's structured, which is often, in a sense, marketing, advertising, tech, different things like this. Hedge fund managers. I'm sure there's some good hedge fund managers out there, but those people that hold the power, it risks them losing their power if the masses are liberated and you're like, maybe I don't need to buy so much to be happy. Right? Like, again, you're right. These arguments have been mentioned so many times, but I think we need to keep mentioning them. I think we need to keep talking about it, because each year we're encountering different versions of ways of, I think, people can get oppressed in maybe more advanced or ways that we need to use these terms in a modern sense to prepare therapists and to prepare clients and to be a voice or to be a candle on the hilltop, so to speak. Not because we're so great, we're such amazing people, but just because we maybe are sick of so many good people cutting their lives short or continuing in things that are absolutely detrimental to themselves, to others, and contributing to the destruction of Earth and dehumanization.
That's right. I think what we're talking about is something that is maybe less spoken about in our discipline than it ought to be, which is that there is a political dimension to our experience, and that our experience of suffering and its alleviation of it has political implications, is politically influenced. And we actually need to be aware of that in order to be effective. We need to understand that that is also happening in the work that we do with people. And I think we're going to do a future episode on critical psychotherapy, and that's a place where we can really really unpack this more. But it's there, it's in the room. We're all wearing that. We all hold patterns of adaptation around a capitalist system, and that informs our experience.
I've really enjoyed discussing all this with you today, Glenn.
Same here, Richard. This has been impactful. I know right now we're in the beginning of this project and we're having a lot of different thoughts, but I think you and I have come to a really consonant position together around the depth of this problem and its real nature. That when we talk about these innovations, yeah, we're talking about individual things, but there's a broader cultural, political, economic interest or influence in this that we're really holding. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to have a friend like you, Richard, to be able to talk to these things about. And I really look forward to our future discussions because I know that you and I have planned several episodes in the future to talk about a variety of different topics in our space. Again, bringing this same expansive, critical, dynamic lens to what we do as counselors and psychotherapists.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm grateful to be talking to a fellow psychology nerd in a safe space. So maybe listeners can just think about, how are we contributing to suffering? How are we positioning ourselves within a capitalist system? This is the most powerful learning, is self-reflection. Think about the impact of the denial of trauma. Judith Herman, I'm very influenced by her writing, Trauma and Recovery. And if they would like to explore some of these great thinkers like Rollo May, etc., and we'll maybe have some show notes and things in addition.
Sure.
So
I think that's
thanks,
great,
everyone.
Richard. Yeah, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.